Now that we're managing the user places as a signal in this service, we can take advantage of this by also updating them when we add a new place to our user places. For that, I'll actually convert back to accepting the entire place object here instead of just the string. And I'll therefore set the place ID in this request body by accessing place.id, because I now want to use the entire place here to update my user places with it. And for that, I'll call update here on my user places so that we get the old places here, and we then update the signal with a new value. And the new value I want to have here is a new array into which I copy my old places like this by using the spread operator. And then as a last element, the new place. And this will update the signal and therefore automatically update all the places in the app that are interested in that signal, like our user places here. Now, since I now expect to get a place here and not just the ID, we also have to go to the available places component and there pass the entire selected place to add place to user places. That's important. But that should do the trick, therefore. If you now save this and you reload and you wait for those places to arrive, if you add a new place, and I'll zoom out a bit so that we can see more places on the screen. If I add this place here, for example, you see it shows up down here instantly. And of course, it's still there if I reload. And this is therefore how we can use this signal to communicate across components and update the UI immediately. And of course, if you were not using signals, you could achieve a similar behavior by, for example, using a subject. That's something you could do if you were not using signals, just as you learned it earlier in the course when we used a subject for cross-component communication in a service. But here, since I am using an Angular version that has access to signals, I'm using that signal feature to implement this behavior with ease. Now, what we're doing here in add place to user places is in the end something you could call optimistic updating. Because in the end, I'm updating my user places before this put request here was sent, and before I even know whether it worked or not. And as a consequence, if we go to the backend code and there to the put route here, if I were to return an error here to simulate that something goes wrong on this backend, if I were to do that here on the backend, and you then would restart that backend server, if you would do that, you would have a bug in your application. Because now if I reload, you'll see that if I add a place, let's say the Taj Mahal, it shows up instantly here, but if I reload, it's gone because it never was added to the backend because we got an error here. By the way, that's not the only bug we have. If I add a place that we had already added, it's added twice now until I reload. And now it did not just fail because I added this error to the backend, but because I have some code in here in general that would have executed either way that would have prevented the same place from being added twice. So these are some bugs which occur now because I'm performing this optimistic updating where I am updating my places before I have a response. Because if I would wait for the response, I would find my updated user places in there and I could use those for updating the UI. And therefore, we should tweak this code a little bit to prevent bugs like this. So how can we tweak this code here to make sure that we don't run into any optimistic updating problems? Well, there of course again are different options, but one way would be to again use the pipe method to add some operators to this observable chain here. And then we could add the catch error operator here to handle potential errors that occur on the backend. Here we then get that error object that's generated by Angular if that request causes an error. And then we can decide how we want to handle it. Now I will return a new observable generated with throw error. And for that you must make sure that this is imported, because this catch error operator always wants a new observable being returned inside of it. So I'll quickly create a new error here to make sure that this is the case. And the error message could be failed to store selected place. But that's actually not the main thing I want to do in here. Instead, I also want to make sure that I roll back my optimistic update here if something goes wrong. And one way of achieving this would be to go here into catch error and to update the user places signal here as well. To do that, I'll actually change my code up here and I'll get my previous places before we performed the optimistic updating by simply reading my signal. As you learned before, this will not set up a subscription, it will just read the value once. Therefore, here we can also simplify this code and not call update, but just set the observable to this new array like this. That's an alternative to using this update method. And if we now have an error, we can take advantage of this previous places constant, which holds the old places before we updated them, to roll back to those previous places. With that, if you save that, here in this app where we still have this error response on the backend, if I add a place, you see it only appears here briefly until that error is caught and then it's rolled back. And that's of course better than what we had before. In addition, I want to make sure that we can't add a place we already added before. Therefore, I'll add a check here and check if in our previous places we have some place using the built-in sum method, which is built into JavaScript and can be called onArray. And that then wants a function which will automatically receive every array element as an input. So every place or every p, as I'll name it here, as an input. And you then must return true if sum overall should yield true and false otherwise. So here I'll check if in my previous places I have at least some place where the ID is equal to the ID of the place I'm about to add. And then I want to check if that's actually not the case. So if sum yields false, which means we have no place in the entire existing places array that has the same ID as the place I'm about to add, because only in that case I want to update my user places. And with that, we should make sure that we don't have duplicate places in our application. So now if I reload and I try to add a place that's already part of the favorite places, like the Amazon River, I can hammer it and it still doesn't show up down there. And with that, we improved this optimistic updating and we make sure that we don't update the UI in a way that's then not in sync with the backend. Of course, with that, we can therefore also go to the backend and get rid of that error, which I added to this put route, since it was only there for demo purposes. And you should restart the backend server after editing the code. With that, if you reload again, you'll see that again, if you try to add a place that is already part of the places, it doesn't work. Also after reloading, it's still only here once. And if you add a place that's not part down there, it does show up instantly here and it's still there if you reload. And that's how you can perform optimistic updating with Angular. It's one way, there would be others, but it is a way that's hopefully quite straightforward to implement.